event with so many distinguished speakers and at such a timely moment. I'm Jaume Duch. I'm the Director General for Communication and the spokesperson for the institution. And first, of course, I would like to congratulate my colleagues both in Brussels and in Washington for having organized this seminar. Our democracies on both sides of the Atlantic are being challenged in ways surely we would not have predicted even a few short years ago. Europe and the United States face this together now after so many years bound by a common history and common values. In the aftermath of the Second World War, our values lay the foundation of a new multilateral world order. And after the Cold War, it seemed inevitable that democracy would spread with a domino effect to our neighbors and far beyond, with the promise of peace and prosperity for all. In retrospect, we were too optimistic. We cannot afford to take the resilience of our democracies for granted now. Both external and internal forces are attempting to put our democracies in question. Our first panel will explore the evolution of these forces and the connection between them in more detail. And our second panel will consider our response as lawmakers. The riots on Capitol Hill on 6 January shocked the world. For us in the European Parliament, it was especially troubling to see lawmakers and staff at the US Congress, our counterparts and close partners, in such direct danger. We knew it was not just the US under attack, but all of us. And we understood this was a wake-up call for all of us too. Disinformation translates into real actions and real harm. We cannot make the mistake of describing it as a problem that belongs to the online world or an issue affecting only a minority of people. We need to bring more urgency to this debate. Disinformation has infected the discussions for every critical challenge we face today. COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and more. Lives are at stake. Our societies, our economies are at stake. The European Union has launched several initiatives to counter disinformation and build more resilient societies. We have an action plan on disinformation, and we have a code of practice for platforms. But we know that the current model of self-regulation for the online world is not adequate. On both sides of the Atlantic, we are now taking a fresh look at legislation that was written before social media emerged as a powerful influence on our public debates. In the coming months, the European Parliament will be working on proposals, digital services legislation, other actions, which aim to defend our democracies and improve media freedom. We need to do this while preserving freedom of speech. The Parliament created a special committee to study the issues of foreign interference and disinformation and to propose effective policy responses. And I'm delighted that members of the European Parliament with leading roles in these tasks are with us today and will speak to you shortly. Elections remain the most important moment for people to have their say. They are also vulnerable moments. All the work we are doing in 2021 is with one eye on the next European elections in 2024 and how we can prepare for that challenge. Speaking of elections, leads me to introduce our keynote speaker. As director of the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, Chris Krebs bore a great part of the responsibility for ensuring the integrity of US elections at the end of last year. On a technical level, the 2020 US elections were a great success and they were declared secure and resilient. Yet, he found himself in the middle of a disinformation storm and a crisis of confidence among a part of the population who had been led to believe a different narrative. For those who follow Mr. Krebs on Twitter, you will know he dealt with that situation with a lot of dignity and even good humor. He continues to be a prominent and inspiring voice amid the challenges we continue to face. So we are delighted to have you with us and to learn from your experience, Mr. Krebs. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Happy St. Patrick's Day. This is quite a timely event, as I think most of you know. Yesterday in the United States, the intelligence community, law enforcement, and civil defense organizations, my old organization, released their after-action report and intelligence analysis assessment of the 2020 election and any impacts on the election itself. Very illuminating. What I'd like to talk to you today about is what we did over the last several years, the things that I think that worked and survived contact with the enemy, so to speak, the things that did not work, and then conclude with where we go from here. Got about 15 minutes, and I'll try to save 5 minutes or so for questions and answers. When I came into the administration, the Trump administration, in March of 2017, the preparations for the 2018 midterm election and the 2020 presidential election were already underway. The Obama administration, in its closing days, had made a number of had taken a number of steps, including designating critical infrastructure, election infrastructure rather, part of our nation's critical infrastructure. And the intelligence community had also released its report on the occurrences of the 2016 election that highlighted 3 primary Russian vectors of attack. And first was trying to hack election systems that conduct and facilitate the elections in the United States. The second was a hack and leak operation against political candidates and political campaigns here in the US. And then finally was a broader disinformation campaign intended to destabilize the United States, our population, and erode confidence in our democratic institutions. And I think as should come to no surprise to anyone listening in, that those efforts never abated and continue to this day, not just in the United States, but all across the country, or across the world. And so as I came into my old role in March of 2017, I had 3 principal tasks. First was to pull together an election security initiative with all the relevant stakeholders across the federal government. And that included the law enforcement apparatus, the FBI, the intelligence community, principally the National Security Agency. And that's where I first had the opportunity to work with Ann Neuberger, who is now the Deputy National Security Advisor and lead for cybersecurity in the White House. And of course, our broader state and local election community, as well as the private sector. And that's to include the vendors that provide election services. But I think, as we'll probably talk a great deal about today, also the social media platforms that were at the center of the after-action review from 2016. So we set about in an effort in 2017 to truly understand how elections work in the United States and work through a series of scenarios. How could our elections be attacked technically? What were the elements of our systems that were potentially vulnerable to a hack? And that work ultimately led to not just technical attacks or considering technical attacks on the election, but also where something could come about like a perception hack, where an adversary could claim to have accessed or infiltrated a system and was able to make a change. And that would come to fruition in the run-up to the 2020 election. Here, we also worked throughout this effort through 2018. And as we worked through 2018 in the run-up to 2020, as we felt prepared, we felt as if we had made sufficient preparations where election hacking, at a minimum, would not be able to disrupt an election, but would at best was a more resilient process. The challenge, though, as I think we all experienced, was about this time last year, the pandemic threw a curveball to all of us in our daily lives, and it made it more complicated for election officials to administer elections in a safe and secure way. And as they say in sports, players are going to make plays. And this happened on both sides of the equation. Principally, the disinformation operators took advantage of some of the shifts in how election administration occurred, including the expansion of mail-in voting and absentee voting, where this election officials would mail home ballots and voters would be able to vote from the comfort and safety of their home and would not have to go in and have contact with other humans. Unfortunately, this was an opportunity for disinformation operators, including the president, his campaign, and others, to introduce the specter of a more fraudulent and potential for a rigged election. So as we prepared for the 2020 and the final throes of the run-up to the election, while we were thinking through how to counter disinformation, for us it was not an issue to take claims and disinformation head on. Instead, our philosophy was to provide factual information to not just the election administrators, but also the American public. And so where there were claims of potential for mail-in fraud, what we did was introduce facts on what security controls were in place. Unfortunately, we probably didn't get the platform or the exposure we needed for our efforts to debunk or provide some degree of rumor control. And of course, as everyone knows, as we run up through the 2020 through October and November, it became a more active space. And as the reports yesterday indicated, there were Russian disinformation operations and campaigns. There were Iranian disinformation operations and campaigns. And the one that's probably most notable there is where the Iranians sent out a series of emails claiming to be from a ultranationalist group called the Proud Boys, and they were intimidating voters. Now, due to the Iranian failure in operational security, they made a number of mistakes, and we were able to identify those emails and make a report to the American public in 27 hours. So first contact or identification of the emails to notification of the American public in 27 hours. And I think that alone shows the maturity of our counter disinformation operations, at least over the last 3.5 years. And of course, as November and December wore on, leading up to the events of January 6th in the insurrection at the Capitol, the big lie, as it is now referred to, really took off and took on a life of its own, again, with campaign supporters and the president himself amplifying some of the narratives that it was a rigged election. And even yesterday, the former president claimed on a TV or news station here that the election should have been overturned. So we continue to battle some of the disinformation from the 2020 election. So let me talk briefly about what I think went right in our counter disinformation operations. First and foremost, it was our preparation, our threat modeling, our evaluation of a number of different avenues or vectors by which the bad guys could try to undermine confidence, which put us in a position to establish our rumor control webpage. And as issues would emerge in the Twitter sphere and elsewhere, we were once again able to put out authoritative information so that the American public could make their own decisions. Now, the second piece here is that our coordination in working with all of our partners, this was an inclusive, democratic, truly event where all actors, in fact, I would say that this was probably the most effective coordination and collaborative undertaking in the national security space that I have ever had the privilege to work with. So hopefully we can tap into that spirit of collaboration going forward for the 2022 and 2024 elections, as well as share findings with our European partners. And lastly, it was truly a shift to an evidence-based election that made us so confident in our ability to debunk a number of the claims that came up about election machine hacking. Evidence-based elections simply means there is paper. There was a paper record associated with 94% of the votes cast in the 2020 election. That is up from approximately 80% in 2016. Most notably, there were shifts to paper ballot machines instead of purely electronic machines in 2 key states, Pennsylvania and Georgia. And if you tracked all the stories and the litigation, those were 2 of the hotbed states in the 2020 election. So again, I'm thankful to the leadership in those 2 states for making those changes. Okay, so what went wrong? First and foremost, there was an asymmetric information advantage to the adversary, to those that shared disinformation. They did not have to be right every single time. They did not even have to be consistent. They could change out the names of states, of counties, of the voting equipment manufacturers on a frequent basis. It didn't matter. That was not their objective, to have a single strike that would undermine all confidence in the election. It was a spaghetti against the wall approach, so to speak, where they would continue to create uncertainty and doubt in the process. And that is that put us in a disadvantage, at a disadvantage, because we had to sift through all the various claims, which leads me to the second point, and that is the analysis paralysis that defenders were put in, due in part to what's known as the liar's dividend, where a liar, a disinformation operator, can spread as much information as they want, but as soon as a national authority engages on an issue, that helps potentially reinforce the issue. So we have to be mindful of amplifying the claims of the disinformation operators, the influencers, and making sure that we don't help them in their efforts. And lastly, ultimately, in democracy, you need 2 willing parties. The purpose of an election is not to convince the winner that they won, but the loser that they lost. And in that effort, you need a party that will play honest and play by the rules. We did not have that in this election. We had one party that would not accept the results of an election, and those efforts continue to today. And the big lie, and we will see that manifest in state level legislation, potentially to erode access to the ballot box in the coming weeks and months. So I think I'll close out here with where I think we need to go. This is not, the 2020 election is not the last disinformation campaign against democracy. It was not the first. We are seeing other disinformation operations continue on to this day. You are seeing it in Europe right now with the COVID vaccine, in part launched by Russia. We are also seeing China erode our liberal democracy position in the world and trying to shirk responsibility, in part for originally lack of sharing of information on the virus. So of the coronavirus. So we will continue to see these as a tool in the toolkit of hybrid operations going forward. So what we need at the national level and at the transatlantic level is clear prioritization of counter disinformation operations. We have not yet gone through the scoping of this problem set. We have not identified all of the players from the federal government side or the national government side. We have not identified all the players in the private sector, and that's not just the platforms, but also traditional media. And we also need academia and civil society in these conversations. In part, that's what I'm trying to accomplish at the Aspen Institute with our Commission on Information Disorder that should have a series of recommendations, both near and longer term, in approximately 6 to 7 months. We also need continued investment in democracy. And here in the States, that means money to state election officials to continue to upgrade and modernize systems so that we don't have lingering vulnerabilities that continue to be targeted and exploited by state actors. We must also make public education civics education, and digital literacy a priority. We must get back to the basics of education on how we got where we are as a democracy. That certainly in the United States has dropped off, and I look forward to best practices from our European partners that they may have developed. And lastly, when it comes to the platforms, and I suspect that will be a large part of the conversation today, of regulation, of social media, and even traditional media. The challenge with the platforms is that the disinformation operators are like water. They will continue to flow to the lowest point. So where some platforms had meaningful terms of service that could take the attack surface away from the adversaries, these terms of service were either not developed consistently across platforms or implemented consistently across platforms. And so what we have to have is better coordination across all the platforms. And we also have to have better transparency into not just what those terms of services are, but the analytics on the back end, so to speak, of the platforms themselves, and open up the data to researchers so that we can have a meaningful after action process and third party independent analysis of how effective we are truly being in deplatforming disinformation operators. Ultimately, I believe that we can make a difference here. It's going to take certainly unity of effort across society. It is not up to one single party. It will not be one regulation that solves this all. It takes commitment, leadership, forethought, and keeping in mind that, once again, this is not just about elections. This is about every other divisive aspect of our society. And I will leave you with one last thought. January 6th and the assault on the Capitol here in the United States will serve as a clarion call and a rallying cry to right-wing extremists all over the world, including in Europe. So we must be very mindful in how we allow the big lie and the thought of a stolen election to continue to permeate. We must call out those and hold them accountable to who continue to undermine confidence and undermine the legitimacy of the past election. That will be a critical aspect in overcoming the pain of the last year. So with that, happy to open it up, I think, to some questions.
Yes. Yes, we have some questions from some journalists. The first one is Mauricio Donini. I'm going to give him the floor right now. 1 second. Okay. View all attendees. Mauricio. Okay, Mauricio, you have the floor.
Okay. Good morning, Mr. Krebs. My English is not very well, but within NATO, alliance from USA and Europe, does a cyber attack on a member country fall within the boundaries of global response, like an armed attack?
For you, Mr. Krebs. Maurizio from Futuro Europa Italia is asking, within the NATO, does a cyber attack on a member country fall within the boundaries of global response, like an armed attack?
My understanding is last summer or the summer before, I believe, under Article 5, there was, I believe it was a decision in London, that there would be, that cyber attacks could be included in an Article 5 decision. So I certainly think that needs to continue going forward. One aspect I will add from the Director of National Intelligence report tomorrow that was released yesterday that I thought was notable is that these efforts, disinformation-related efforts, may now be becoming accepted normative behavior, frankly, that it's becoming acceptable for state actors to attempt to undermine confidence. So those are the sorts of conversations I think NATO and the North Atlantic Commission, or Council rather, need to take on in some of their hybrid threat conversations.
Okay, we have another question. Irina Nedeva from the Bulgarian National Radio. You can have the floor.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly.
Oh, okay. Well, my question is, did you find a direct link between QAnon networks, disinformation, and foreign players, foreign agents? And what was the most difficult to unravel in these hybrid election operations?
In terms of connections between QAnon and state actor operators, I would have to go back and well, of course, I would defer to the intelligence community on any of their findings, but I think it's commonsensical that anytime a conspiracy claim starts to hit the mainstream, rather, that you'll see state actors, you'll see particularly the Russian and their operatives start to amplify those issues. Again, I defer to the intelligence community. In terms of the toughest thing to unravel, again, when we were through our rumor control page and our amplification of facts on emerging claims against the election, it's that asymmetric piece that was so complicated that we would release information on how election machines actually work, and even if you did hack them, there's still a paper-based trail. Look, on Twitter, my old agency, it had 100,000 followers. I had 10,000 followers at the time on Twitter, and these claims were being magnified by people with 89 million followers. So whether that's point one, point two is fundamentally some folks just don't want to hear the truth. They are committed to their view of the world, and that is, I think, the greatest danger going forward. One of the things that we've been thinking, that I was always thinking about is there is a certain part of the population that I will not be able to change their mind. I just fundamentally accepted that. My point then was to keep others from falling into the fever swamp. How could we keep others from becoming, beholden to that narrative?
Okay, we have another question from an Italian journalist to Ugo della Ciprete from Ambiente Europa. He's asking, is there evidence that anybody in USA cooperate with Russia, or it was just a Russian plot?
I think the intelligence community assessment that was released yesterday is fairly clear that agents of the Kremlin, including some cutouts from Ukraine, Kalimnik and Derkach, coordinated or at a minimum provided information to U.S. officials and those close to the president. So this is not just about single shots being lobbed from Red Square. It is now an outsourced offshore operation that is increasingly becoming closer and closer to the U.S. We also saw some innovation, and that they outsourced operations to African states as well as one operation out of Mexico. So they're starting to, the disinformation operators at least, are truly beginning to cover their tracks and create, or attempt to create rather, plausible deniability in their operations.
Okay, I'm going to give just one question more the floor, because we are really going against the time. So Emmanuel Vincent is asking you a question directly.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm Emmanuel Vincent, Director of Science Feedback, and we have partnered with scientists to study how Facebook is limiting the reach of misinformation accounts, what they call repeat offenders. So we are basically seeing that they are failing to apply some of their stated policies, and I'm wondering if you're interested in this kind of data, and if so, how can we reach out to you to share this information?
Thank you. I think those are the kind of findings that would be helpful as we look at through the Aspen Institute Commission on Information Disinformation. So we will see how we can connect. But that was a key finding of the Election Integrity Partnership, which was a group of academic institutions here in the United States that concluded that when it comes to really magnifying disinformation and key themes, it came down to just a handful of really super spreaders, so to speak, because it does act like a virus, and there were a handful of them that were pushing out. And so the more directed action we can take against those super spreaders, I think will have a much more effective outcome in terms of cutting back on disinfo. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention, Mr. Krebs, and for being with us here. I'm going to pass the floor to Jaume to say goodbye and to Delphine to enter here.
Thank you, Mr. Krebs. It was a very inspiring speech and elements that will certainly feed our reflection ahead of the next European elections, because the reflection is already going on for 2024. So thanks a lot. And you see there was a lot of interest from media. It's clearly an open topic. So thanks a lot for your presence again.
Thank you. Ciao.
And again, good afternoon or good morning for those watching from the US. I will continue and move on with the first panel we have for this afternoon after this first keynote speech. I'm Delphine Collat. I'm the Deputy Spokesperson of the Parliament, leading the team that scrutinizes the question of disinformation in DG Communication. Our first panel addresses the question of dichotomy between the domestic actors and foreign actors regarding disinformation. And it's a very timely question, because following the publishing of the report mentioned by Mr. Krebs yesterday by the US Office of the Director of the National Intelligence on the 2020 presidential elections, it is striking that this report reflects the trend that we already see on a daily basis. That is very often or not possible to talk simply about sources of disinformation in terms of foreign or domestic. Foreign sources increasingly influence and amplify domestic disinformation and vice versa. It echoes also our findings regarding the European elections in 2019. What we fear the most, direct foreign interference to our voting structures, was either insignificant or ineffective. Nevertheless, influence operations were present and continue to be a worry. So we are looking at a very complex and interconnected picture and a very difficult challenge to our institutions and societies. To make sense of this, I'm delighted to welcome our speakers for the first panel. And we will start with Mrs. Kalniete, member of this European Parliament. She's the rapporteur of the special committee created in 2020 on foreign interference in democratic processes in the EU, including disinformation. Mrs. Kalniete, the Oxford annual report on social media manipulation shows that the number of countries that are engaging in disinformation is increasing, from 28 in 2017 to 80 now reported for 2020. So as a rapporteur for this special committee, what are the lessons learned so far?
Good afternoon, or yes, good morning also probably. Thank you for this opportunity, dear organizers, excellencies, guests, journalists, and all those who are following us online. I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude for this invitation, and I'm also very positively encouraged by the gender balance in this entire event. And I would like also to say particular thanks to you, Chris Krebs, for excellent insight you gave into the disinformation campaign around the US elections. Indeed, the challenge of disinformation is pervasive, ambiguous, and all-encompassing, rendering it very difficult to solve through legislation. At the same time, it is also transnational and domestic by nature, requiring creative and ambitious policy solutions. At this time, the EU continues to face a range of disinformation campaigns by hostile state actors such as Russia, China, and as you just said, and others, which could be translated currently as 89 others, as well as by non-state actors, such as terrorist and extremist organizations and criminal groups. And I would like to take this opportunity to discuss this challenge in terms of two issues that we are currently focusing on in the INGE committee at the European Parliament, and namely covert foreign funding and information laundering, because both of them have destabilizing effect on democratic process and particularly on the elections, the most direct influence. During the work in the INGE committee, we have learned that with disinformation, we can only see the visible part of the iceberg. It is more difficult to identify the underlying huge financial resources, vested interests, and very often covert foreign funding. There is a critical lack of transparency in this domain, as despite high-flying rhetoric, political rhetoric, it is often nearly impossible to track the flow of money. For instance, who is spending money for the benefit of a particular political actor or group. However, there is one common factor. Radical and anti-EU domestic actors, who tend to be kings and queens of disinformation, receive substantial financial support, most often in covert form, from third countries or other foreign actors. Another phenomenon in this context is so-called information laundering, and we heard about it also in the keynote speech by Krebs. To put it shortly, information laundering is a deliberate process when false or deceitful information is legitimized through a network of intermediaries, gradually obscuring the original source and replacing with new, more trustful, more local, more friendly one. For instance, Russian and Chinese disinformation financed by state is often deliberately laundered through acquired or fake media outlets that are based in the EU, thus making this disinformation appear more legitimate in the eyes of the society. This mechanism is by nature similar to money laundering. I believe this concept of information laundering perfectly captures the essence of what we are discussing here today. Disinformation is such a complex challenge that lines between domestic and foreign actors, as well as between state and non-state actors, is blurred. However, there are some encouraging signs that the EU will act as a standard setter in regulating the digital environment. Nevertheless, we need not only EU, but ideally global standards. And I'm very encouraged by signals from the new administration in Washington that there is a greater willingness to pursue transatlantic cooperation in these important digital policy issues. And to conclude, I want to stress that EU and ideally other democratic actors should seek to underline and, if necessary, to impose the costs, both financial and reputational, of foreign interference from inauthentic and covert offline and online activities. Here I conclude, and I thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Mrs. Kalniete, for your inspiring words. We continue with Mrs. Veld. Mrs. Veld is also a member of this European Parliament, and she's the chair for the Democracy, Rule of Law and Fundamental Rights Monitoring Group in the Parliament. Mrs. Veld, good afternoon or good morning, depending on from the US. Is the Civil Liberty Committee concerned with this domestic dimension of the problem?
I think we all are. And I would just like to make a few remarks to maybe tilt the perspective a little bit, because I have the feeling that ever since we started to talk about fake news and disinformation and what have you, that we tend to focus fairly obsessively on the social media. And we seem to think that fake news and disinformation is a new phenomenon, but it isn't. It's as old as the world. It has always existed. I mean, look in history, and there have always been the craziest stories that have been embraced by people, and that went around very, very quickly. So there's nothing new under the sun. I think you can even see it in the relatively recent history of Europe. But I think we shouldn't forget, and of course, you know, a lot of initiatives have already been mentioned, including by Mr. Krebs, that are incredibly important, because of course we have to eliminate it at the root. But I think we're overlooking a couple of big elephants in the room, and that is the people and the sources that we actually consider to be, let's say, legitimate. Let's say. People like heads of state, heads of government, Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, and there are many others who are talking a lot of nonsense, and they're very close to the very sources of the fake news on social media that we've just been talking about. And the point is, you don't really need social media as an amplifier, as Mr. Krebs said, when you have the president of the United States saying the very same things. And that's a problem, and you see that both in the United States and in Europe, we have big difficulty defending democracy when it's under attack from the inside. The second thing is, and it's in the slipstream of this, is the regular media, because yes, social media are influential, but still their reach isn't as big as, for example, regular media like Fox News. Or if we see how, to stay within Europe, how the Polish and the Hungarian authorities have completely captured the media, the public media, which have become the state media. So then, you know, they have a massive amplifier. But there we say, yeah, but that's all, yeah, that's difficult. We can't tackle it because it's part of the government leaders. I mean, and that is something there where I think we should be a lot more courageous and outspoken. And that brings me to the third point, and that is, you know, why do these people get so much room of maneuver? And that's because, let's say, the democratic forces, whatever color they may belong to, they are tempted to echo the same populist anti-democratic narrative. But they do it in a more, you know, in a milder form, maybe. But they're also tempted to, for example, attack the democratic institutions, attack migration, attack the European Union, and they're maybe not as rough and as aggressive as the populists are, but they're doing very much the same thing. If I look in my own country, for example, if I see how, I'm not going to name any names, but say leading politicians are spreading caricatures of the European Union, caricatures of certain countries in the European Union, certain nationalities which are supposed to be, you know, lazy and fraudulent, and whereas of course we, the Dutch, we are always working very hard and we're very, very honest. And I have noticed, even in the Dutch public debate, that these caricatures, because they're not being countered by anybody, they have become the truth. And if you then tell the truth, then people don't believe you anymore, because the caricature is the truth. So if you say that the caricature is a lie, then people don't believe you anymore. And there's also this tendency of political leaders to put themselves a little bit outside the democratic system as an outsider, because they become more popular. But in doing so, they have been eroding our democratic institutions rather than strengthening them. And I think if you look at the European democratic institutions, it's a very dangerous game. So I think this is something that should be much more part of the debate. And then finally, about the funding. Just this morning in our committee on constitutional affairs, we were having a debate about the funding of European political parties. And what I find rather paradoxical is that the European Parliament is funding European political parties and political foundations. those political parties, but in particular some of the foundations, are actually very close, are connected, literally working together and also financially connected to some of the movements and organizations which are attacking democracy. For example, there are some political foundations which are working together with Steve Bannon. So somebody needs to explain to me why the European Parliament is funding organizations which are undermining the European Parliament and for which we then have to, come up with solutions against fake news. It doesn't make sense. I mean, we're funding our own downfall somehow. That's and the final argument, final element is I do think that some electoral systems are also more vulnerable than others. I have the feeling, okay, maybe I'm prejudiced because I come from a country with a completely proportional system. There are no thresholds or hurdles or anything, and it's very pluriform, maybe even too much. We're going to have 15 parties in a parliament of 150 now. We have elections today. But I have the feeling that is more resilient against this kind of attacks than, for example, first past the post systems or these, two-party systems or something like that. I would leave that to the academics to investigate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Veld. As we see, it is a really complex issue. We will now turn to our NATO guest today, transatlantic by nature, I would say, Ambassador Baiba Brage, Assistant Secretary General in charge of public diplomacy. Thank you for accepting the invitation. Ambassador, disinformation is being weaponized, so how do you evaluate the threats it represents? What is NATO at the moment's current line of action?
Thank you very much for the invitation and for having NATO at your discussion in the European Parliament, and greetings from the other side of Brussels to all of you. Good morning, America. The very fact that we are having this discussion, I think, very clearly shows the seriousness of the challenge. We have been talking about, as Sophie said, about the fake news and the variety of terms, and we have tried to define what we are talking about with a number of definitions, as we saw in the joint communication by European institutions. Also internally in NATO, we are discussing that. But essentially, we have to understand that we know the diagnosis more or less, and we have to decide what we do about it. And again, EU and NATO and other like-minded institutions that are all part of the sort of Western democratic world and international multilateral democratic system, of course, are very much part of this challenge. And we are there, both the EU and NATO, to make the lives of our people better, to defend democracy and liberty. We are based on values. So, the very existence of our institutions, of course, is there for the people. So we have a mandate to do something. And our mandates, of course, EU and NATO mandates are different. NATO's mandate is collective defense, and our three core tasks have not changed, which is collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. And they indeed are as important as ever, if not more. But if we think about it, both our institutions and organizations is about keeping our people safe. And for NATO, it's 1 billion NATO citizens. And also making sure that they live better, that they live the lives they deserve, and that the whole of Euro-Atlantic region is safe and secure. And both NATO and the EU have faced interference and foreign attacks since their inception. And in NATO's case, indeed, with respect to our mandate, which is a military political organization, we have faced the subversion and hostile actions and propaganda and disinformation since NATO's creation. So those methods have not disappeared, as we all know, but today we do see much greater sophistication and also intensity and scale of what we call hybrid activities, including disinformation. These activities and threats today are partially invisible, and they are also largely non-kinetic. So there are no guns fired, let's put it that way. So the foreign actors, and I speak about foreign actors and foreign interference in that respect, use a hybrid combination of military and non-military tools to create the ambiguity and blur the lines between the peace, crisis, and conflict, which was not so typical earlier. And that makes NATO's job rather difficult. These foreign actors target civil societies, they target private sector, they target our publics at large, and the aim is to polarize the societies, weaken public trust in democratic institutions, whether it's governments or parliaments or other democratic institutions, and ultimately to undermine our values and the very essence on which our organizations are founded. And of course, the distinguishing between foreign and domestic actors is a challenge. And again, we all know that. Foreign actors' aims are to exacerbate the tensions and to kind of pull the wedge and push the wedge among the different groups in our societies and trying to leverage domestic actors. And of course, the current technological advance has ensured that information and disinformation has no borders, and through that, it's very difficult to stop it. So in that respect, it shows the need to be very vigilant. So in NATO's case, we work very, very closely with allies, with NATO member states. We work very closely with our international institutions to make sure that we have what we call the model of understand and engage in the best possible condition. Understand means that you understand what is happening to you, what is happening in the information environment. So we have quite strong investment in that sphere also to really see indications and warnings and understand what is happening, but also to analyze and engage on that basis. And that is through proactive actions, through proactive communications, in my case, with our audiences. So I can indicate sort of 4 lines of action that we have taken and that we have decided are important. One is we need to invest in strategic communications capabilities. We all understand that we need to invest in military capabilities such as ships or drones or other equipment, but we also clearly need to understand that the same applies to strategic communications. We need to invest in people, in skills, in technology, to make sure that we have the awareness, and that is for each ally, and that is for NATO as a whole, but that we have the awareness, the understanding, and the ability to communicate and influence. Second line of action is we need proactive communications. So NATO is a values-based organization, and we use fact-based, credible public communications to tell our story. And our aim is to tell NATO's story first, to make sure that both our publics and our adversaries hear and know what NATO is doing. And that has been true also during the pandemic. We have really concentrated on telling what the allies have done to help each other, what the military has done for the civilians, for the medics, and so on and so forth. We also carefully evaluate whether we need to debunk or refute every piece of disinformation. As you know, sometimes responding to each and every piece can actually run the risk of amplifying it and giving it more oxygen. So we are pretty selective about what we do. We expose the top myths and bigger information narratives regularly. The third big line of action, and that is also where EU has invested a lot, is raising overall resilience of our societies, including the private sector, the civil society, academia, media, all parts of our society. And that is with a clear understanding that to keep our countries and societies safe, we need strong military, but we also need strong societies. So And that is where we need the whole society approach. And we expect that in the upcoming NATO summit, this big line of work also will result in some divisions. In our understanding, everyone has a role to play in countering disinformation: the media, the private sector, academia, civil society, all relevant groups, to make sure that we are equipped to resist foreign interference and understand how to do that. And that applies to cyber, to information domain, economy, or other domains. And the 4 big line of action, and this is why I'm here, is cooperation and coordination with our friends and like-minded institutions. And here, of course, the EU plays a particular role. We have very close relations with our colleagues in the Commission, in the External Action Service, the Council, but also now with the Parliament. And I'm very pleased to see what you are doing. It's not only exchange of information, but also actually learning the lessons, understanding where you have seen and what you have done and what works, what doesn't work. We also together exchange regular information with the G7 rapid response mechanisms, the UN, UNESCO, and other global partners. So in conclusion, let me say that the foreign interference, including disinformation, is not new, but it can be especially dangerous in the current conditions where we have the technology advances and enablement that allows it to spread so fast. Hybrid threats that are there, that are below the military threshold, do threaten our societies and our way of life, and we have to take them serious. There is no single solution, and a complex set of actions need to be taken by all. And we are all in it together. Private sector, governments, civil society, politicians, civil servants, media, free and independent media, everybody. And we all have a role to play. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Brache. I think we learned the lesson that everybody has a role to play, and we hope to play our part as support in the administration of the Parliament. Our members are certainly doing a lot in the different committees at the moment. For now, as the 4th panelist joining from the US, Keisha Gonzalez. Hello, good morning, in fact. You're Senior Director at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Mrs. Gonzalez, how do you evaluate maybe the new trends or regarding these complex threats from your side of the Atlantic?
Wonderful. Well, first of all, thank you so very much for the kind invitation, for hosting me. And I am in awe of my fellow panelists as they're speaking. I am immensely encouraged and happily surprised that after 6 years of working on this issue, we are speaking almost from the same script in acknowledging the challenge that disinformation is to our democracies and our democratic institutions. I was also very encouraged to hear Chris Krebs earlier this morning, and a big congratulations to him, to CISA, and to the Department of Homeland Security for ensuring that the United States had its safest election, you know, on the technical side, but also in terms of how much they coordinated across the United States with state secretaries, preparing, talking to civil society. We had several conversations with them. They sought to understand the challenge. And so, like I said, you know, I've been working on this issue since 2015. And of course, our partners and allies in the Baltic states, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, have been telling us about the challenge of disinformation for years. So I'm sure that they are you know, quite, you know, encouraged as well to just see how far we have come on the conversation. So I will just, you know, I want to add to what my panelists said. A lot of good things were discussed, and I look forward to fleshing them out. But I want to focus on 3 key areas. I want to talk about, you know, the good, what has happened since 2016 that I see are positive trends, the bad, or that we still need to work on these issues, and then how do we actually go from here? How do we address the challenge going forward democratically? And so the good. democracies have woken up to the challenge of disinformation, and that is very good news. There is a near consensus globally that disinformation is a threat to democratic institutions, to our democratic discourse, and that is the first step in actually having some action around it, right? We have all government officials in the panel, and hearing them say that this is one of the key challenges facing democracies is very encouraging. It is actually the right step. The researchers is the second good news. The researchers, civil society, they have really done the heavy lift in the last couple of years. The reason why we understand the challenge of disinformation and how it actually affects our societies is because of the great work of the researchers, everything from the Oxford Internet Institute to the Shorenstein Center at Harvard University. There is a bigger understanding of the data, how information travels, what platforms they live in, the cross-pollination, and the actors, right, both domestic and foreign. So, big push on the researchers and civil society that has done a key duty to actually inform citizens. They have been the messengers. They have been the ones hitting the pavement to ensure that we understand this challenge, that the day-to-day person understands the challenge, and have done a lot of the legwork in protecting our elections. I have to say there is some good on the platforms. Social media platforms have actually moved forward in actually curbing some of the things that have happened across their platforms. Everything from, what we saw in the US 2020 presidential election, everything from, political ads and their policies around that, labels and tracking. There was clear, transparent communication from the platforms on decisions that they were making about what information was and was not allowed to stay on their platforms. And I think that is a very positive step. I should also say that platforms did do quite a bit in terms of coordinating with civil society and opened up in conversations. That isn't to say that there isn't a lot more to do, but that in itself is very, very encouraging in terms of the platform action. Now, the bad. As we saw from the intelligence community report yesterday, foreign disinformation continues to be a threat to democracies. So we'll touch on domestic in a bit, but foreign disinformation continues to be a threat. Everything from Russia to Iran to China. We see that foreign actors continue to try to undermine democratic institutions. And here I should split it up slightly a bit, because the report did highlight that it was Russia and Iran that were actually trying to interfere in the US election, whereas China did conduct information operations, but mostly around COVID-19 and bolstering their image, which is consistent with what we understand between Russia and China in terms of their information operations. But foreign interference continues to be a threat. Domestic disinformation is a bigger threat now facing democracies. And the reason why I say it's a bigger threat is because it is our day-to-day citizens that are engaging in spreading disinformation. And not intentionally, but rather because this is what they believe, because it matches their worldview. You see a lot more of the micro-influencers. So folks that have smaller followings, you have more private groups, right? So, communities that engage around the same beliefs. This applies to anti-vaxxers, these applies to QAnon believers. So you see a lot more domestic disinformation that is, it's smaller, but it's more effective in that way. Of course, there is some coordination and some ties between foreign and domestic, but the challenge of attribution, one, is something that we still need to be looking into, but two, it is very clear, and we saw this on January 6th, that there are individuals that do believe in this information, that they do actually share what they see as their reality, that they share what they see as their facts. And so domestic disinformation becomes a bigger threat to our democratic institutions, because it poses a challenge for governments. And how do you actually address this challenge when it is your citizens expressing themselves, when it is your citizens that believe this, without going into a authoritarian, regulatory framework. And so this is going to be a continuing challenge. I do agree with Sophie on putting too much onus on the social media platforms. What we've seen is as more fringe groups get banned from places like Facebook, Twitter, they have found alternative platforms, which is another added element that we're seeing on disinformation that is going to continue to be on the rise. Another thing that has really clearly brought up so much is, of course, COVID-19. COVID-19 has provided a fertile ground for disinformation, particularly domestic actors. This is where we see a lot of the health mis and disinformation, anti-vaxxers, conspiracy theories around vaccines. And here I just want to pose out, the Center for European Policy Analysis just launched a report on Monday looking at disinformation around COVID-19, looking at Chinese and Russian narratives around this challenge. And what we have found is that, of course, there is a lot of it's a fertile ground for this kind of information. It is very effective, and there's definitely a lot to uncover there. The last thing, just to ensure that I'm keeping this short but to the point, democracies, we are still weak in our response, and we've heard this in this discussion already. We are still needing to improve our coordination, our collaboration across not just governments and civil society, but we need to be including the private sector. We need to be including media. We need to be working on a whole society approach, and that it's still lacking in my view. So how do we resolve this issue? And I'll wrap up here. To my mind, disinformation is a lot like tobacco. It is addictive, it's bad for you, and it's not easy to quit. As a citizen living in a democracy, this is very much, tobacco, the smoke is very much the fog that is trying to undermine our institutions. But like tobacco, governments cannot simply ban disinformation. They cannot simply, impose restrictive measures on the platforms, restrictive measures on media. They have to find a way to be able to coordinate. And this is where the whole of society approach really comes in. Like I said, there needs to be a lot more coordination across government, civil society, and the private sector and media. There is, of course, education, right? We, in the United States, our challenge is that our education is not centralized. So how do we actually do media literacy? To address this challenge, this is where civil society comes in. It is about getting the platforms to engage in more transparency, allowing researchers more access into their working so that we can understand and help in this environment. It is about governments coming to the table in building greater trust with its citizens. Our democratic institutions, I think our elections have proven, 2019 parliamentary elections and 2020 US presidential elections, that our democratic institutions are strong, but they are vulnerable, and they require a lot of work from all of us to ensure that they remain. Democracy is not guaranteed. Democracy is something that we have to work at. And as disinformation threats and actors continue to find ways to undermine our democracies, this is where we have to come together and actually move forward. And so with that, thank you so very much for the invitation to make this intervention, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Indeed, our democracies cannot be taken for granted. I think it's time to move on to the questions. Eva, there were some questions from journalists online.
Yes, and we have quite a lot of questions right now. So I'm going to give the floor first to Marta Gigli. 1 second. Okay.
It might also be good to say who you address the question to.
Okay, Marta, you have the floor. Marta Gigli is coming from Italy, from Eurofonica.
Thank you. My question is for Ms. Kalniete. And considering the phenomenon of foreign interference, the European Union has long criticized Russia for spreading online misinformation, even linked to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now it's named China as well. But a few days ago, Borrell declared that today the External Action System does not have a mandate to effectively study disinformation and hybrid attack coming from China. So indeed, the EU Foreign Service Disinformation Department has a dedicated unit looking at Russian disinformation campaign. But is the EU planning setting up a similar unit tackling the disinformation campaign coming from Beijing as well?
Very pertinent and good question. It's true. I was present when High Representative said that the External Service has no mandate, but it does not imply that he cannot dedicate certain resources of his services to have those who are dealing with increasing China presence and interference. I'm representing European Parliament, and in European Parliament there is ever-growing consciousness about the Chinese interference, and one of the examples is that just a week ago, European People's Party, which is the biggest group in the parliament, we adopted our first position paper on EU-China relations. I think that is one of the first steps. And at the end of the year, most probably from the European Commission, we will receive the investment agreement, which was negotiated and agreed at the end of the previous year. There are quite many positive aspects in this agreement. However, there also are some questionable and disputed aspects in this agreement, and I believe that we in Parliament will have quite a tough time finally to come to vote and to support this agreement.
Maybe there is another panelist that would like to react to the question of our Italian journalists regarding resources to check on Chinese influence operation. Yes, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Just to say that de facto, of course, all the officials and organizations do communicate, and the important part is to make sure that our communications are credible and fact-based. That is the best way to actually disempower any foreign source trying to disinform. NATO last summer published actually a public report on NATO's approach to countering disinformation, and we also gave some examples on the Chinese disinformation from official sources that were affecting allies. And there is quite a lot out there in the public domain from various academic and very credible research studies around this. Again, we have to make sure that we ourselves have credible communications and that we understand what do we want to say and how we want to say. That really needs proper investment, and that is one of the best methods how to counter foreign disinformation, be it from Russian, Chinese, or other sources.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think we have other questions, Eva?
Yes, we have other questions. We have Christina Kashial from Alpha News in Cyprus, and she asked me to read the question. Turkey, a member of NATO, and because of the question, I guess it's for Ambassador Bracha, is using propaganda against Cyprus and Greece very often. What is NATO and the EU doing to prevent it and protect other members?
That question was for me, as I understand, right?
Yes. Yes,
okay.
Ambassador.
Well, the NATO has 30 allies, and we are all one big, rich family. We are different, we are not the same. And Turkey is a very valuable ally, and Turkey has committed, of course, and is part of the NATO treaty with regards both to democratic values and freedoms and liberties. So in that respect, full commitment is there in terms of participants. there have been differences among the allies, and there have been obviously ways how we address at NATO those differences throughout NATO's history. As for the particular actions of a particular ally, and I'm sure that Cypriot society and government is able to handle it on its own. It's not my place to comment that or not. Thank you.
I don't know if any of the panelists would like to react. Otherwise, we move on to the third question. Eva? Yes,
we have another question. I will give the floor to Judith Czerniajewski from Radio Klub Radio in Hungary. 1 second. Judith. Okay, Judith, you can go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity, and I address my question to Mrs. Veld. From the only remaining independent radio in Hungary, our radio was forced off the air, which act is likely the part of the government disinformation propaganda also. It makes it really hard for the opposition to voice its opinion, its policies. The legal procedure of club radio or radio for the frequency has just started. Most likely, the verdict of the court won't be presented until the next year's election. So we can't reach people in countryside via internet. Where are we functioning now? So this fight seems to be over. How do you evaluate the situation?
Yes, I think I've touched upon it already a little bit in my initial intervention. I think it perfectly demonstrates the not just the paradox, but also to a certain extent the hypocrisy of the European fight against fake news and disinformation, because we talk about foreign influences the whole time, and we are completely silent about the elements within our own system that are trying to break our democracy from the inside. And I've mentioned Hungary, I've mentioned Poland. I consider that the European Commission is far too weak, too timid, and too reluctant to act. Just today, I've published a blog criticizing very heavily Mrs. von der Leyen, because now that we have a new tool, rule of law conditionality, the European Commission basically refuses to use it. I think also in the European Parliament, and I think Mrs. Kalniete and I are probably very much on the same wavelength here, we've been having debates which are sometimes very difficult, because sometimes it concerns people and parties who are a member of our own family. But if we don't have the courage to speak out, then what is happening in Hungary, what's been happening for the last 10 years will take place. And then we can have all the fake news countering policies in the world, and we can have the disinfo lab and heaven knows what. It doesn't help. It doesn't help. And finally, I would like to say, if the other heads of government remain silent, they are complicit. They are complicit. And they have stood by and let this happen over the last decade. And therefore, I would like to underline very much that if we don't if we only look at countering fake news and eliminating it, and we forget about the resilience of our own democratic systems, including free media, then we're destroying our own democracy. So I wholeheartedly concur with you, and we will, from the European Parliament, try and give whatever support we can to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. in Veld. Are there any other panelists that would like to react to this question? Indeed, resilience building is at the heart of the European Democracy Action Plan that is presented by the Commission and that will be debated in the Parliament in the coming weeks. Maybe there's another question, yes. Indeed.
We have a couple of more questions. There's one also for Ms. in Veld, and is referring to the contrast of misinformation. The question is from Gabriele Frongia from Sardegnol in Italy. And she's asking if contrast misinformation and disinformation is a priority for the EU. Why the main European call proposal addressed to contrast disinformation are more for national level and not for local level? How about contrasting? How about contrasting this information at local level and not only at national level? I would say. Local media. In the media.
I'm not sure what you mean by contrast. I suppose countering misinformation and disinformation, because I think, of course, you need to do that at local level if that is where the disinformation is spread. But that's usually also called public debate. But of course, what we are talking about now is a much bigger phenomenon. Is indeed foreign actors, or indeed very influential political leaders or otherwise opinion leaders. But I think the actions are no different at local level than they are at national or European or indeed global level, because I think one of the proposals by President Biden when he was still campaigning that I found very interesting is to create a global summit for democracy. But I think that means that will be a platform where we can talk about joint global action, but also what we can do at European level, at national level, and sure, of course, also at local level.
And I have a final question. I'm going to try to give you the floor. He didn't tell me if he wants.
Sorry. I just wanted to comment.
Yes.
Could I comment? Continue what Sophie said. Thank you. Because in the very beginning of the question, what you read or what I heard, there were two terms: misinformation and disinformation. And I think this is a very fundamental problem what we are facing, because all the debate what we are having is how to recognize illegal content and how we recognize harmful content and harmful intent. These are two things which are difficult to find the line. But if we look to harmful intent, is it used nationally, locally, or on the level of European Union? If you use harmful intent for quite a long time, then finally you have the 6th January event in Washington, because harmful intent is accumulating and it's transferred, its changes in harmful intent which have consequences and aggressive actions. And I am particularly grateful to Democracy Action Plan, European Democracy Action Plan, which will try to build the bridge between the Digital Service Act and Digital Market Act, and this where these categories are classified as legal. To understand when democracy is endangered by harmful content. That I consider is of utmost importance, what Sophie is all the time speaking about, the internal harm done to European democracy. Thank you.
Mrs. Veld, you wanted to react.
Yeah, no, just 10 seconds, because I was triggered by something that Sandra Kalniete said, referring to the events of the 6th of January. And it gives me the opportunity to illustrate with an example what I mean. And that is that there is one government leader, I'm not going to name any names, there's one government leader of an EU member state who, until the day of today, has not actually publicly declared that he accepts the election results in the United States. So that means that we have government leaders who themselves are undermining trust and sowing doubt about elections, about democracy, and about democratic institutions. And then if you get disinformation or misinformation, as Sandra rightfully said, it falls on a very fertile ground, and it has somehow been legitimized by somebody in a position of authority.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we have a last question that is addressed to all participants to the panel.
Yes, we have a last question, and I think it's a nice question to finish with. It comes from Ioannis Giannakopoulos from Thessaly TV in Greece, and he's asking if would it be a solution to have more transparency from the democratic institutions in order to alert the public trust against fake news attacks?
Mrs. Kalniete, then we will follow the same orders as we did in the beginning.
Okay, thank you for this question. Of course, transparency is the basis for democracy, and there always will be need for more transparency, even in the countries where national legislation concerning political advertising or elections, political party funding is on the level like in Nordic countries and in Baltic countries. Still, there is a need for more transparency because, for instance, in my country, political advertising is possible and political support for political parties only by a physical person, not by legal person, which prevents third-party funding. But what is also of utmost importance in the current situation is that we have transparency in political funding, transparency in platforms when they use political advertising, and also transparency in platform algorithms, how they are applied for the safeguarding of democracy against harmful content and against fake news. It's very banal as a term, but how that is implied. Thank you.
Mrs. Veld.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree with that. Sandra already mentioned algorithmic transparency and a couple of other measures that can be taken. But again, like a mantra, I would like to repeat that the same should apply to, let's say, traditional media, but also the democratic institutions. I think we urgently need more transparency on media ownership in the European Union, because we see Fox News-like outlets being taken over by we don't know who the ultimate owners are, and they play a very important role, and we need transparency there. But also the institutions, just I think 2-3 weeks ago, Transparency International issued its annual report on transparency in the EU institutions, and I was very sad to hear that the leadership of the European Parliament had refused to cooperate with Transparency International. My group has immediately called for the leadership to cooperate, because I think we should set the right example.
I'll pass the floor to Ambassador Fassi.
Thank you very much. Indeed, the credibility and trust of our societies to our leaders, to our institutions, as credible sources of information is very important. Furthermore, there are other credible sources of communications and information that are out there and that are as important. And we have clearly seen that the proximity of those sources, be it academicians, be it researchers, be it journalists, is crucial for the public to actually understand and to be aware, and also to know how to counteract in these cases, be it cyber or disinformation attacks. And again, when we think about the wider picture, of course, quite clearly, as Ms. Kalniete said, we have to be quite clear what we are speaking about. Are we speaking about hostile acts by foreign actors that are wedging within the existing differences of our societies? And we have to be able to identify and counter those. Are we speaking about deliberate spread of and intent, therefore, of spread of these hostile actions and disinformation with the meaning to undermine us? Or are we speaking about the freedom of opinion, where in our societies, indeed, people have a choice they have a choice. That is the basis of democratic societies, to even spread the misinformation. But we have to, it's our task as, again, our societies to, of course, enable them and to give them the knowledge and the understandings that it's not a wise and it's not the right thing to do. So the sort of more proactive engagement, and as locally, as close to our citizens, it's done as with more credible sources and with more engagement by the citizens themselves, as better indeed. Only that way we can get the strong societies that we as countries need as alliances and as organizations. Thank you.
Mrs. Gonzalez, maybe to conclude some words and then, yes.
Thank you so much. Well, you know, I think whether it's hostile acts or innocent lies, whether it's disinformation or misinformation, our goal should be facts and truth, because that's those are the pillars of our democracy. And so, yes, transparency is great, but what I would also say, in addition to that, fund civil society. Government is not always the best messenger. A vibrant civil society can help bolster our democratic resilience across the board. Support local and independent media, you know, so that we have good reporting and our citizens have access to independent reporting. Coordinate across stakeholders. You know, the following panel will be speaking about regulation, and of course this one focus, yes, on platforms. We need to ensure that platforms are part of the conversation, that social media platforms are part of the conversation, that governments are talking to one another, that US and Europe are talking to one another. I think that, yes, transparency, but a lot more coordination. Let's support all levers of our democracy, and this is how we thrive.
Well, thanks a lot. I think to our four panelists, it was a lively discussion and there was a lot of questions, and we'll move to our second panel now on the fighting disinformation and modernizing our online regulation. I'll pass the floor to my colleague, Rafaela De Mate, who will moderate the second panel, and I see our next panelists have joined already the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Delphine. Thank you to the previous speakers for the interesting discussion. And now we go into, what can be done in the regulation level, because we have seen the European Union has launched several initiatives to counter disinformation, such as the Democracy Action Plan, the Action Plan on Disinformation, the Code of Practice for the platforms. We have discussed of this. However, and this is a more recent, it was also very clear that the current model of self-regulation was not adequate anymore. So in this panel, we will be talking of how to improve the regulation for the online environment on both sides of the Atlantic. So of course, we will start from the experience in Europe. In December, the European Commission published its proposal for a Digital Services Act. And I would give the floor first to the rapporteur in the European Parliament, Mrs. Christel Schaldemose, who is responsible to deal with this file, to steer this file in the European Parliament for the Internal Market and Consumer Protection Committees. Welcome, Mrs. Christel Schaldemose, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and I really thank you for arranging this panel, this discussion. It is very timely. It's also a very difficult topic, because how do we really tackle the challenges we have? You know, on the one hand, we have seen more and more the digital services becomes an important backbone of the digital economy, and this is good. It brings new opportunities for our societies, and we can promote innovation, and we even give new choices for citizens and consumers, and businesses, which is good. However, there are also issues we need to tackle when it comes to algorithms. I think they challenge our democracy. The very big online platforms, they challenge our level playing field in the internal market, and online marketplaces, they are challenging consumer protection standards. So we need to do something about this, and that is what the Commission has done in the DSA. they have, and I think the proposal is a very good starting point. They have tried to tackle the challenges, but I'm not sure that we are there yet. I think we need to do more. What we need, in my opinion, is to kind of take back control over the platforms and over our society. I think it is important that we dare regulate the platforms. Today we have a kind of a Wild West, and I think that we need to do something to make sure that it's another Wild West, but it's a well-functioning West, and therefore we need to do something. And what I think we can do in order to facilitate a more level playing field in the internal market, protecting consumers and citizens and businesses, but also protecting our democracy, is that we need to make sure that we have more transparency around the algorithms that are used. They need to be tested, and we need to make sure that we know what they're doing, so that the businesses, the users in general, no matter whether you're a business or a consumer or a citizen, knows what is done and how it's done. I think it is important that we make sure that the algorithms are not kind of making sure that the more extreme points of views are coming forward, or illegal content, or misinformation. So I think we need transparency around algorithms. That's a very important tool. But I also think that we need to have stricter rules when it comes to online advertising. We have seen also during, for instance, the COVID-19 crisis, a lot of products sold online, trying to say that this is a solution to protect yourself against COVID-19, which is of course not true. And that has been advertising. I think we need both stricter rules on what we allow online, but also a much better enforcement about what is there. We need, for instance, faster taking down of illegal content, and we need the platforms to stop the misleading advertising. In Europe, it's not allowed to mislead the consumers, not offline, not online, but we need a tool to make sure that we can enforce it. And then I also think, of course, we need legal pathways for, because when we demand more of the platforms to do something, to regulate, to make more transparency around how they moderate content, etc., then they will of course also take down content, and maybe even often more in the future than they're doing today. But then of course we also need legal pathways for users to complain, to get information about why they're taken down, and of course also complaint systems, so you can tackle the issues. Because it's important that you give the users, no matter whether you're a business or a consumer or a citizen, you need to have rights towards the platforms, and you don't have that today, which is of course also problematic. And then I think a last thing that is not in the proposal, but I think we need to work on that. We also need to create a better functioning internal market with better competition. And therefore, I think we should also work for interoperability of platforms and services. So it could be possible to use one platform and still communicate with users of another platform. You know it already today from emails. No matter what kind of email system you use, you can cooperate, you can write to each other. And we have seen also an unbundling in the electricity and gas supplies. So I think we can do more also on this. We need interoperability, so you as a user not obliged to use the big ones if you don't want to, and I think that competition could also be useful. And in these ways, I believe that we can do more for the democracy, and I think that we can make sure that we take down what is illegal, and we can get transparency about how they moderate content online. But I think that we need to regulate. We need to make sure that they are not just doing it on the basis of what they think, the platforms, but of what we politicians, what the democracy thinks is important, since they are becoming public spaces. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for being short and to the point, and we will take the questions later. Now I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Adamowicz, Magdalena Adamowicz, another member of the Parliament. You are the rapporteur on strengthening media freedom, the protection of journalists in Europe, hate speech, disinformation, and the role of platforms. So we have seen regulation can do one part of the work, but how do you see, what else can you propose and you see that can be done at the European level to tackle disinformation? Mrs. Adamowicz.
Yes, good afternoon or good evening to those who are in States. Thank you very much for invitation, and thank you very much to this timely discussion of the topic today. So disinformation is certainly nothing new, but internet changed the way that it's being amplified. So and this is a deal breaker. So conspiracy thinking and simple manipulation, of course, always existed. This is something that certainly predates the era of social media. Well, but unfortunately, the current design of internet makes it easier than ever to target vulnerable audiences with the propaganda and give the conspiracy thinking more and more visible. So last year and 2020 in particular were a tipping point, not only for us as legislators, but also for platforms in understanding and acknowledging the true power of online disinformation and impact of the liberal democracy, its processes and institutions. Online platforms were, of course, never built around the idea of strengthening democratic values or enhancing media freedom or pluralism. So they were built around the idea of making profit by commodifying the attention of million users per day. So the unintended grave consequences that are nowadays obvious to everyone, you know, as legislators, we need to work on making the internet a space that promotes democratic values instead of destroying them, you know, that makes a conversation better instead of worse. So we need to work on structuring online space so that citizens, businesses and political actors have better incentives, more choices and more rights. It means that as politicians, we need to work with scientists, with experts, with activists, and with ordinary people to co-govern the technology that affects everyone's behavior, and it's detrimental to our lives, democracy, and economics. So the Digital Service Act that my colleague Christel just talked about is certainly a crucial and important step we are taking legislatively. But we can and we need to do more. What was crucial for me in my report on strengthening media freedom was to show that disinformation, media capture, and hate speech are now the basic tools used in process of introducing authoritarian rules while maintaining the formal appearance of democratic election. So, and that combating those phenomena is it a fundamental factor in terms of the defense of the rule of law and democracy in the EU. So the report got adopted with an overwhelming majority, and as such served as a very strong voice of the full House ahead of the presentation of the European Democracy Action Plan by the Commission. So for too long, we have been taking our democracy in European Union as granted, as my colleagues said. For too long, we believed it was built on unbreakable foundations. So now in many places in Europe, we are in the position of not only thinking how to protect democracy, but how to actually run to it, return to it. And ensuring media freedom is of crucial importance in this context. So, in fact, for democracy, not only to function well, but to exist in general. Free and independent media are perhaps the most vital. So, and it's precisely them that can serve as a true medicine for the virus of disinformation. They can be a beacon of hope in the world of informal disorder. So let's remember one thing, that a vote cast out of hatred, out of lack of information, or on the basis of disinformation, even if truly counted, will never be a democratic choice. It is at most a formal caricature of it. Thank you for now.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Adamowicz. And I am now glad to welcome Susan Ness. Susan, if you can please turn your camera on. She is a distinguished fellow at the German Marshall Fund in the US. So, Susan, we would like to hear about the other side of the Atlantic. What is the point of this debate in the US? What is developing there in terms of the ideas and the practices regarding regulating online disinformation?
Well, first, I want to thank the European Parliament for including me in this most timely and informative session. My main message is that Europe and the United States should work together more actively and include civil society, academics, tech companies. We need all hands on deck to address disinformation. First, the state of play in the United States. Europe, as everyone knows, is years ahead of the US in examining these issues and fashioning regulatory responses. Europe's more attuned to comprehensive legislation to unify the single market. And the Code of Practice is an excellent example of efforts to address problems while respecting fundamental rights. Congress is now focused on a host of issues involving online platforms, not just addressing disinformation. Most of the US focus is on modifying Section 230, the safe harbor from liability for intermediaries carrying third-party content. Republicans and Democrats hold polar opposite views on what the problem is and what should be done. So Section 230 bills are most likely not likely to pass. Republicans argue that platforms suppress conservative speech, that they're biased. Democrats, on the other hand, argue that major platforms aren't removing enough hate speech and disinformation, especially around elections and COVID-19. They should block more. A recent study by the Stanford Internet Observatory on Disinformation from the 2020 election found that the preponderance of disinformation and conspiracy theories was disseminated from highly coordinated far-right sources. But when platforms delete these posts or suspend accounts, Republicans accuse them of conservative bias. So they are in a vice. Some approaches, legislative approaches, Senator Mark Warner recently focused on platform business incentives that are designed to increase time spent by feeding increasingly toxic material. He introduced the Safe Tech Act, which would eliminate Section 230 immunity for ads or content for which the platform received a payment. It shifts the burden of proof to the platforms and opens them up to expensive litigation discovery. Senators Schatz and Thune are expected, that would be bipartisan, are expected to reintroduce the PACT Act. Some of its provisions mirror the European DSA, including transparency and disclosure requirements. Section 230 protection would be eliminated once the platform has actual knowledge of illegal content or activity and has not taken it down within 24 hours of acquiring that knowledge. Republicans have introduced several bills, but most are focused, once again, on the claims of conservative bias. The arguments against repealing Section 230 basically are that they will not solve the disinformation problem. It's a blunt instrument. It may result in dropping popular services that include user-generated content. And it may be a problem for smaller platforms, such as a Wikimedia, that do not have resources to fight litigation. Other legislation pending in Congress indirectly may address disinformation. Privacy legislation has a longer history of legislative work and potentially may pass this term, with California and Virginia having state privacy legislation that has compelled companies and bipartisan responses. They could limit collection of user data that might alter platform business models away from disseminating problematic but highly engaging content. We have folks focus on antitrust matters, but legislation on antitrust is a long way from passage. And then recently, the introduction of the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act would allow print, online, and broadcast outlets to band together to negotiate content deals with major platforms, and that has bipartisan support. And also, the White House has signaled its intention to get tough on big tech companies, largely by appointing 2 more aggressive antitrust and consumer protection advocates, Columbia Law professors Tim Wu to the National Economic Council and Lena Khan to a seat on the Federal Trade Commission. My recommendations for addressing this echo much of what Chris Krebs and Geisha Gonzalez recommended. And that basically is requiring transatlantic cooperation amongst government, tech companies, and the public. The EC Code of Practice is an excellent place to start. Its review showed that progress was made, and I encourage implementation on both sides of the Atlantic of the recommendations that the Commission's review of the Code of Practice provided. The need to improve disclosure, enable vetted researchers to gain access, greater communication among the platform's safety and trust teams to ferret out bad practices, and improving ways to distribute accurate information on election, COVID-19 vaccines, and the like. The DSA, I would add, has many excellent provisions that we on this side of the Atlantic might want to consider. Some of those, we can work together on protocols for vetted researchers and enabling access for the researchers to information. Common definitions for reported data to facilitate comparisons, common ad transparency rules, protocols for independent audits of major platforms, including the impact of referral and prioritization algorithms, a great place to begin. So we ought to also work together on due process, providing redress for users whose content was removed or content left up. And there may be many multi-stakeholder solutions that both protect fundamental rights and address some of these very serious problems. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Very constructive and to the point ideas and debate, Mrs. Ness. And now, again, the floor to the other side of the Atlantic. No, he's here. Okay. Tyson Barker is with us. He's head of technology and global affairs at the German Council of Foreign Relations. So you are in Europe. But you have a view on how the US and Europe can cooperate on this topic and how they can complement each other. Mrs. Ness already gave us some suggestions and ideas. Maybe you want to comment or complete this?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much to the European Parliament for having me. And and for allowing me to be part of this really distinguished dual sessions. I learned a lot, and I found myself nodding along with many of the comments. I think that we've already advanced the conversation beyond where it was even 3 months ago when the Digital Services Act and the European Democracy Action Plan were introduced, and that's a great sign. I mean, when we start, we all start from the same point of departure, which is we want to preserve freedom of speech, robust discourse online, freedom of expression, and freedom of opinion. And when you look at the Digital Services Act, I think there's a lot there to be admired on both sides of the Atlantic, as Susan Ness just pointed out, and actually gave a great list of places to start really getting down in the dirt and really working together on. I would flag that that view is shared by both the Commission and many governments in Europe, including Angela Merkel, who in a letter on March 2nd flagged that we need to have a new initiative on platform regulation, building on the current discussion on the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act in the EU. So the EU is ready to have this conversation. And I think that even, and this conversation shows it, it has been heavily inflected by events in the United States, particularly the events around January 6th and the decisions by certain platforms to deplatform President Trump and others, which led to a lot of questions on this side of the Atlantic. And I would just flag a statement that Commissioner Jourova made in the European Parliament, where she said the fact that they can remove the account of a sitting president based on vague criteria and unclear oversight is very worrying. And I think that that is part of the heart of what the DSA in its disinformation piece really wants to address, which is selective enforcement. It wants to create, I would say, a new regulatory philosophy for dealing with open, liberal, democratic spaces for speech. And it does that in a way that I really admire and was flagged by Tom Wheeler, the former head of the FCC, who said, you know, in the past, when the Industrial Revolution was taking place, the regulatory environment had to match the organizational philosophies that we saw taking place in the private sector. It had to be more regimented, it had to be more mechanized, etc. And I think that this first attempt in the Digital Services Act is a way to try to create a regulatory ecosystem that reinforces transparency, accountability, and oversight. And the way it does so, I think, is again quite clever and quite cognizant of fundamental rights and democracy and the rights and responsibilities of online platforms, and in particular very large online platforms, in that it says you are responsible for creating your terms of service. You can, as in the past, adopt the voluntary codes of practice. But what we want to do is create an oversight ecosystem based on users, compliance officers, external risk auditors, trusted flaggers, a European board for digital services based on national point people in European countries, and ultimately backstopped by the Commission, which has some enforcement authority. So you set your own terms, but you have to enforce them in a way that's transparent, explainable, and accountable. It can't be selective enforcement that doesn't, that's opaque and not necessarily abiding by its own terms. So already the Digital Services Act maintains the liability exemptions that Susan Ness was speaking about, big debate in the United States. It maintains the ability of platforms to create terms of service, but creates this cumulative obligations for online platforms, intermediaries, and then very large online platforms with over 45 million users, including the conduct of annual risk assessments. They need to be subject to independent auditors, and this co-regulatory framework around their own terms of service. And then finally, and this is something that was flagged by Chris Krebs, is the ability for the academic community to have access to their data, so they know how enforcement is actually taking place and what are the incentive structures. How does it look? What's the secret sauce? Without taking proprietary information from platforms. So I just think it's quite a good, elegant start to readdress regulation of social media and online platforms, particularly in this age of disinformation, in a democratic way. Maybe I can flag 3 quick issues that I think we should be cognizant of as this debate moves forward, because we're going to be having this debate for at least a year. The first is the attempt of national governments in Europe to repatriate a lot of the authority and responsibility held in the Digital Services Act. So already the French are talking about we should be the ones, national governments should be the ones to define things like illegal content. They want to widen the definition of harmful content and disinformation. And also the ability to levy fines should be with member states and not with the Commission. And of course, not only does that kind of break the logic or weaken the logic of the digital single market, but it also could open up for new interpretations of what illegal and harmful content is. And I think we can have that discussion in the Q&A. The second issue I would flag is, to what extent are we creating, being a little provocative here, Maginot lines for transparency, oversight, and accountability? And I would just flag 4 trends that we see in the online information landscape that might not be properly captured right now in the Digital Services Act and its relationship to the potential code of practice in the European Democracy Action Plan. The first is the fragmentation into niche platforms, which has already been raised. So a lot of these smaller platforms are not going to be caught by some of these graduated obligations that are in the DSA. The second is the hybrid social media space between closed messaging services or quasi-closed messaging services and social media. And how is social media defined? And we've already seen this debate here in Germany with the Netzdg law, where a big source of illegal content and incendiary content is taking place on Telegram, which is not caught by Netzdg. The third is the movement away from targeted advertising. And I know that this is a big debate in Brussels, but there is a move away from targeted advertising towards subscription-based models for social media. And I think that that is something that we need to consider as we think about what are the new incentive structures that will be emerging. And the fourth, and this has been flagged throughout the day, and I'm glad, is the role of influencers as super spreaders, as information launderers, and how are influencers and traditional media, which has an influencer function online, being integrated into the process to create incentives on social media generally. And then the final issue I would flag, just having some experience with Netzdg and GDPR, et cetera, is the issue of international mirroring. So if we're creating a law in Europe or in the United States, to what extent can we expect this to be copied in other countries, but enforced in other ways? And we've seen this with the Netzdg law in Russia, Venezuela, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Turkey. We see new attempts to regulate speech in India, which should be concerning for us. And we want to make sure that we're not, that is being taken into account as we develop these kind of new laws for content moderation and dealing with disinformation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. A lot of food for thought and challenging points, Mr. Barker. Thanks a lot. I don't know if Eva, if you have any questions. I have several in mind, but
yes, we have a quite practical question from Ioannis Giannakopoulos from the Greek TV. Ioannis, I'm going to give you the floor right now. Okay. Go ahead, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon. We saw the last days that many governments in the United European Union that stopped vaccination with the AstraZeneca vaccine based on a rumor that was some problems somehow, some way, somewhere. How can governments fight disinformation when at the same time they are victims of disinformation in such a critical issue like vaccination in Europe? That's the question. Thank you.
Whoever wants to answer. I think our members, maybe Schaldemose. Yep. Okay.
Well, I don't agree with you that it was based on rumors. Denmark, my country, was one of the first to suggest to stop the use of AstraZeneca for a while researching some of the incidents we heard about with the blood clots. It was not based on rumors at all. So I simply don't agree that you have an example here.
Thanks. Anybody else on this, Mrs. Adamowicz? No. Oh,
Yeah.
yes,
I would just flag that this is also a sign of democratic resilience on social media, because there was an extremely lively discussion, a lot of criticism on both sides, plurality of views about the decision, at least here in Germany, to suspend giving jabs of AstraZeneca. So we see democracy in action in some ways in this case study.
Schaldemose, you want to continue?
No, but I just want to agree with Tyson Abaker. I think, you know, in many ways, we saw a very good discussion online and people raised questions which were brought also to the politicians and the health authorities. So it's fine that we can debate, but the decision of stopping the use of AstraZeneca in several countries in EU was not based on rumors. That was only, it was important for me to emphasize that, at least not in Denmark. It was based on the authorities who got information about side effects, possible side effects of the vaccine. And then they said, well, this is serious, we need to look into it. So in order to have time to do that, we will stop using it. And that spread around with when the other health authorities in Europe also got the same kind of information from their own system. So in fact, the stop of AstraZeneca was an example of not rumors, but showing that the health systems and authorities in Europe worked well.
Thanks a lot. Mrs. Adamowicz, yes.
Yes. So I would like to add that the access for real information is very crucial, and pandemic was like a great acid test, you know, of our social, political, and economic system. And it is a moment where our democracy is put on trial. So we have seen, you know, the power of manipulation and lies and disinformation, and this, you know, lack of reliable information. So the chaos of pandemic was exploited by conspiracy theories and anarchists, and probably also by the services of foreign countries that wish to destabilize the European Union. So we can see China and Russia trying to push their products even to our European member states.
Good, okay. Is there any other question? I have a question for Mrs. Schaldemose to go back to this point that many of the speakers mentioned, this access of information to researchers. What would this mean in practice? What is the benefit of the society if researchers can access data from the big platforms? What is the implications for citizens?
No, well, first of all, I personally think that's a very good idea. I think it is important when we would like to look into the, you know, we have this discussion, we want more transparency around the algorithms, but the platform says that it's a trade secret kind, it's a business secret, they don't want to reveal it.